I think that the language of science can be divisive for us. It helps us communicate within the field, but it can make it harder to communicate out of the field. My research in science education has been about how to communicate complex topics to just everybody. You should be able to tell your dad, you should be able to tell your grandma. When we get down to the core meaning of what we're trying to convey with climate science, we're talking about how conditions will change around us, conditions that we experience every day. So finding ways to reach out and make that information accessible, it's important. Everybody deserves to know.
Okay.
No, I'm just glad to talk with you. Thanks for your patience with scheduling it a little ways out and talking with me in the morning before optimal caffeination might be achieved. I appreciate all of it.
No worries. No, it's a privilege. I've been watching your videos for a while, and I really appreciate that you're able to deliver climate science in such an easy to digest way, especially now, especially the hurricane season and just a lot of the really weird kind of climate events that have been happening for a while. So it's definitely important. I would like more eyes on you and your work. Yeah, on that note, I'll introduce you, Dr. Emily Schoerning. You're a science education specialist. That's kind of your primary position. And you also founded American Resilience, which has this overarching goal of getting useful climate information into the hands of every American. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and then also American Resilience.
So it's American Resiliency. AmericanResiliency.org I could buy for $100, whereas American Resilience was $10,000. And as
Oh,
I said in the recent Milton and Helene video, I don't have $10,000. So this was a startup effort because when I started working in climate back in 2015, it seemed really likely to me that we were going to overshoot the 1.5C limit for the Paris Accords. And that if we're going into an overshoot of 1.5, helping people understand what the changes would be like on the ground so that they can respond is an important public good. But when I got ready to found American Resiliency, I did some survey work to ask a lot of people across the country if they even knew that local climate projection was available, and less than 3% of people knew that. So helping to get that information out there so people can understand how their homes will change and how they can get ready to respond to change is an important public good. And there was really no one else filling that niche. I knew that people could understand climate information because I've worked with people on it for a long time. And I think that sometimes the language of science can be divisive for us. It helps us communicate within the field, but it can make it harder to communicate out of the field. So for many years, my research in science education has been about how to communicate complex topics to just everybody. You should be able to tell your dad, you should be able to tell your grandma what you're working on as a scientist. I think that when we get down to the core meaning of what we're trying to convey with climate science, we're talking about how conditions will change around us, conditions that we experience every day. So finding ways to reach out and make that information accessible, it's important. Everybody deserves to know. I hope that's a clear enough answer.
yeah, no, that was super clear. I think that's like an incredibly important initiative and very necessary right now. I think you see a lot of issue with science communication. I guess like on that note, why do you think people are so bad at communicating science in general and especially climate science?
So I think that a big problem actually relates to the 2008 financial crash. And this is going to make sense. When that happened, we saw big changes in America's newsrooms. All of the major news networks used to have professional science writers who were trained in science communication. Those people all got fired. And that's why we had a tremendous decline in the quality of science journalism. Broadly speaking, there are still some like bright lights out there. The Guardian does great climate coverage to this day. But we lost people who had that translation capacity, people who could communicate to a general audience and people who could communicate with the language of science. I think that it is a really serious but underexplored problem in our society. What happened when we lost our science journalists?
Do you think also there's some issues in terms of like muzzling of scientists? Do you think it gets to kind of more intense levels of science suppression? And then also, If you could speak on the spread of disinformation too, and kind of um, just journalists having difficulty interpreting and packaging information in a palatable way.
Oh, wow. There's a lot of relevant points that you're talking about there. I think that there is pressure within the scientific community because there is such intense competition for grant funding. And a senior scientist needs to get continued funding because she's not just thinking about supporting herself and her family. She usually has a whole team of people who are depending on her. People who trust and relationship she's cultivated with them for years to keep the lab running. So when we're talking about this funding competition, we're talking about putting food in the mouths of people you care about. And it's known that funding tends to proceed along certain lines. So there's pressure to tell certain kinds of stories. I think that this is one of the reasons that we don't get enough attention to the potential of land use change and landscape transformation to help us sequester carbon and get emissions meaningfully down, get greenhouse gases meaningfully bound back into the earth instead of polluting the atmosphere. In terms of disinformation, it's so bad. It's so serious. You know, we're talking about a reality. It's not a conspiracy that foreign actors, notably Russia, pays people to engage with socially divisive topics online to make climate seem more controversial than it is. In the American Resiliency community on YouTube, I have been very vigilant about zapping trolls. I was fortunate in high school, I studied Russian. I feel like I can understand, like, when you see the syntax of a Russian speaker writing. And if it's like some crazy thing that's designed to like make me irritated, I'm like, this seems like potential misinformation. And I block the person. I think that there's a lot of pressure for people communicating both in the news and even on small YouTube channels to leave every comment up so that you get more algorithmic engagement. And so creators, journalists are all inspired to like let controversy give you some rage clicks, and it decreases the quality of our content. And I felt like I just didn't want to play that game. I wanted to try and put something good out there. So I've been a very vigorous troll zapper. And I feel like you can see that people who are engaging with the content want to engage positively. I am not bothered by people disagreeing with me. I'm not bothered with people pushing back at me. I want to be able to have a real conversation. And if people have questions or doubts or concerns about how I'm interpreting the information, I want to address those. Sometimes people who disagree with me on the videos really drive me to new levels of understanding and help me explore new ideas. I think it's very important to separate disinformation from discourse, and that we need to do more to suppress disinformation without suppressing discourse, if that makes sense.
I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on people that are maybe more susceptible to this disinformation or more skeptical of especially climate change science. I'm originally from Alberta, which is really reliant on fossil fuels. And this is like an area where you do see a lot of discussion in terms of like the need to have pipelines to almost see oil as like a form of like social identity. I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on if this is something that could be addressed, even if we're effectively communicating science, if we can also communicate the kind of more human level in order to curb their attraction to climate denialism that might fit in. Sorry, my cat's making an appearance.
That was really cute. I think that this identity thing you talk about is really important. And that's something that's been very important to me in my climate communication. I see myself as aiming my material on climate much more towards a rural or agricultural audience than I think most climate is pitched. And I often speak to these issues of identity. When I started working with climate in 2015, I was working mostly with agricultural communities. In 2015, there was a popular narrative in the news that the reason we couldn't take action on climate was because all of these people in rural communities won't do anything. They're holding everything back. And so I wanted to investigate that, right? I went out, I started doing climate science in places where climate was a controversial topic, was a socially controversial topic. And I found that if I was willing to spend time connecting with people so that we could develop a relationship. I was interested in being genuine with them, not being an authority coming in and telling them what to do, that we could have really good conversations. A lot of people, when I go out in public now, will tell me, well, I don't believe in climate change. And I'm like, well, you worry too much about what you believe in, but do you want to see what the USDA is projecting? And they're like, well, I do want to see what the USDA is projecting, right? For me, it's not about belief. It's about, can we have meaningful access to what these projections say? And can we decide how to respond to that? I think that that's very different from taking an identity shifting approach. It respects all of us as being rational, thoughtful adults. And I think more of us are rational and thoughtful than we would like to believe in the social media echo chamber. And that a lot of people, if they can connect these changes in ways that potentially support an identity, that can get behavior change. And that's what we need with climate. We don't need identity change, we need behavior change. A lot of our agricultural communities and our communities that, like in Alberta, are providing energy. It's not that they want to pollute the Gulf with toxic runoff and pollute the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. It's that they want to feed people. It's that they want to keep people's lights on and their houses warm in the winter. Finding ways that help people fulfill these important missions is crucial so that people can have an intact, meaningful, healthy, community serving identity in the face of this time of change.
I really like that focus on identity and not trying to alter it or trying to kind of just push aside how important some of these values are for these people. I would kind of wonder if like somebody from a rural community who, their livelihood is attached to the fossil fuel industry or some sort of polluting industry, what sort of evidence in terms of like access to information, such as the USDA, would you provide that you feel is the most effective in demonstrating that this is like a real thing with real consequences? What would you demonstrate to them or show to them in terms of scientific results?
So when you say that, do you mean show evidence that like greenhouse gases are changing Earth's climate? Or how are they projected to change? Because I feel like those are very different questions.
For me, one of the most effective studies, I don't know if this is still accurate, but it was this idea that I would hear a lot. It's like, oh, well, the earth naturally warms and cools. And there was one paper I was looking at where they were talking about how we're actually in like a cooling cycle right now. And it's like, yeah, that's true. It alternates, but we are also affecting this cycle in itself. So I kind of mean like just studies that maybe go beyond demonstrating that it's just warming, because a lot of the time I feel like they write it off because you hear that argument like, well, it warms and cools naturally, or it's not really like influenced by us.
Well, like it can get pretty intense if you start learning about paleoclimate. We do see in the ancient climate record that the Earth has been very different at different times in Earth's history. But I feel like a lot of people who want to really hang their hat on that, on Earth's environment, Earth's climate is always changing. It's really a mechanism to avoid behavioral change. I think that if you look at the rates of change, and that's something I'm always interested in, is like looking for where is the lower rate of change in the projections, right? Where is there more stability? It isn't, is the Earth's climate always changing versus are we the only people changing it? It is, this rate of change is bananas. We are currently engaged in a bananas bonkers rate of change. If you look at any glacial sampling, any long-term evidence for how carbon dioxide levels have changed in the atmosphere, we're in really unprecedented territory. And I think that focusing more on what is in front of us, what scenarios are in front of us, can be more effective for behavior change than getting hung up on, is it happening or not? It's like, look at Asheville. That happened. Look at what is going on in parts of Vermont. Look at what happened last summer with the terrible wildfires in Canada. Stuff is happening. I'm from the northern Midwest. You're supposed to have to design your Halloween costume to be in your full winter gear. And it's 82 today. This stuff is happening. I feel like it's easy to not want to respond to change. As general rule, people don't like change. But what we are seeing all around us is that things are getting a little weird. You mentioned at the beginning of our time together that there's been like a lot of weird stuff happening recently. And it's because Earth's deep systems have something weird going on. In 2023, we have started seeing these unexplained behaviors coming out of Earth's deep systems. It's hotter now than climate modeling projected that it would be. We are at that 1.5C boundary, and we have been at or above it for more than a year. And some people don't want to talk about it because they're like, oh, that 1.5C thing, that's a rolling average. Let's talk about it in 5 years. Let's talk about it in 10 years. But if we look at the type of change we are seeing in Earth's deep systems, if you think about it like a human patient, if you think about it as a patient you love, it's like we see that our mother is having a stroke. We don't wait for her to have 5 strokes before we seek treatment. Treatment matters. And we're talking about tipping points above 1.5C in Earth's climate systems, where if we hit the tipping point, it causes dramatic system change where we can't go back to the way we were. It's really important to try to do what we can, if it's possible, to stay away from that tipping point territory. It looks like it's closer than we may have thought.
What do you think would be some effective communication techniques for people who have loved ones or people close to them that are a little bit skeptical or are resistant to this idea of like behavioral change when it comes to tackling climate change?
I think that asking them if they're willing to look at what 2C would look like in their area and not say, I don't care if they don't want to listen to me. I want them to have access to the information. It's very likely that we're going to get to 2C before 2050, which is when basically all the international community had targeted 2C. If you're living in some areas like Phoenix, Arizona, the hot season increase, you're looking at another 70 days over 95. And almost 20 of those are over 105 by 2C. Where you might want to make changes to protect yourself and protect your family. We are getting a clear idea of where these really intense storms are heading that cause these terrible flooding rains. If you're potentially in the path of that, I really, beyond any identity or belief question, I want you to know. I want people to have access to the information. It's not about belief. If there are opportunities or challenges heading your way that the climate science can help illuminate so that you can respond, either to take advantage of an opportunity where there's some places where there's a longer growing season coming, there are opportunities coming, or to respond to a challenge like unexpected wildfire, big changes in weather patterns, big changes in hot season increase, things that are dangerous. I just want people to be able to get a heads up.
Yeah, no, that's those are all very good tips. I think that I hope that can help people that I get a lot of comments from people that say like, oh, like I wish I could communicate this to like my mom or my dad or like, the Thanksgiving dinner conversations that can get quite heated. I guess moving from like the family, more like intimate layman environment, what sort of advice do you have to scientists and researchers when communicating to the media or publishing their own work to make it more easily accessible and readable to the general public?
I think it's very important not to make assumptions about what terms people know. And that can be super easy to do because you're so like in your world, right? I think that it would be really helpful if, as part of peer review, we also had not peer review, where there was just an interested person who followed that branch of science. Where's the summary for them? Where's the plain language summary? This would be helpful in communicating across fields too. I think that we need to have, as a regular part of the scientific conversation, plain language summaries that make our communication effective outside of field as well as inside of field.
I really love that idea. I'm in psychology, and that is especially a field where, especially in like social psych, people will run with one very kind of mild-mannered study where it's just not a huge like effect size, not a huge sample. They're not really saying anything, and you'll just see headlines that are just making huge extrapolations. And I do think that, psychologists or researchers tend to blame like, oh, the media is really running with this. But I love the idea of having like a non-peer review or having kind of like simplified language, because I think that that would lead to more responsible research and more responsible knowledge dissemination. I guess shifting from talking to people that either are skeptical or don't have enough access to the necessary information about climate change, there's also a growing number of people that maybe have like a lot of access and they're very aware, maybe a bit too aware, if you could be in some way, but maybe more so in kind of a psychologically crippling sense. And here I kind of want to talk about your thoughts on climate anxiety and how people can deal with that, especially younger people.
It's a real challenge. It's a meaningful challenge, a meaningful source of pain for people. And I think that especially young people who are coming into a society where housing costs are so extreme, where it's really hard to get started. And then you look at this reality that the climate is going to get worse. We're probably dealing with a more challenging future. I can see how all of that can come together to help make people feel helpless. And I think that this is the most important thing, is that if you're struggling with this anxiety around climate, if you feel paralyzed and hard to make decisions about your future with climate, you have to assess, what are you doing to respond, and try to focus outward. There's important internal work to be done, internal resilience work to help us deal with trauma and keep moving forward in times of struggling and times of change. But the first thing you need to do is put on your oxygen mask. Look at the local changes. You can look at the state level outlook on my channel. You want to look at the NCA 5 update of the 2C outlook for your state. That'll help you see what the direct risk is to you as we move towards 2C so that you can respond to the risk. I think many people are reluctant to plan a life, to take steps forward, because they see themselves as being in enormous personal physical danger from climate change. The unfair but real projection information is that most of the US remains quite habitable by 2C, and that's not true worldwide. There are countries that are much more severely impacted. We need to get into a position where we don't center ourselves as the big victims of climate change, where we see ourselves as powerful and able to act. There are other people who are facing much more serious and dangerous outcomes. You should try to get the information about what changes are likely on the ground so that you can respond. I think that if we are looking at some of these worst case scenarios where it gets out of control and everyone is going to die, the reality is we were going to die anyway. So why not make a beautiful stand in this time that we have? You know?
That was very well said. Because, yeah, I am used to, there's a lot of people around my age that have just kind of signed off. And there's a lot of bitterness towards like the previous generation in terms of maybe some neglect and a lot of denial. And it does feel like, being tasked with things that happened before us, which is not unique to this generation, that happens across history. So I think that's a really important reminder. And I especially would like if you could speak more on how much there's like inequality in terms of which countries are actually being impacted by climate change, and how we could get people to be more kind of motivated to think in terms of that and to actually think about, the possible consequences of climate refugees, for example.
So I think that it comes down first to plants. There are biological limits for photosynthesis. You start to see photosynthesis, the fundamental way that all of us are getting food is from plants making food, and they do that through photosynthesis. At 116F, plants start to lose their capacity to fix carbon. We are hitting heat waves in Southeast Asia. It went over 116. In the Middle East, it's going over 116. We're looking at a future where in some of the equatorial and tropical regions, agriculture may be impossible because plants will not be able to fix carbon. I think that that is the sort of fundamental, terrible information that we really need to look at in the United States. We have projections at 2C for how many days we'll have over 105. That has relevance for transformations we need to make in the American agricultural industry. I think that it's important to recognize that North America, not just the US, but Canada, the US, and Mexico, are really important food exporters to the rest of the world. And doing what we can to put on our own oxygen masks so that we're still in a position to give is very important. I have a big focus on biodiversity as well because I love life. I love living things. We're in an extinction event. You know, it's acknowledged by scientists across fields that we're losing the diversity of life. And we know that so much diversity of life is held in the tropics where we have this terrible vulnerability to heat, where we can't afford for the temperature to go up too much, right? I think that when we look at what we have in North America, we have life permitting conditions, and that saving what biodiversity we can is very important. I spend a lot of time immersed in very sad climate stuff. And then on my around my house, I do habitat creation. So I'll look at like the terrible outlook for Arkansas, which I'm sorry, Arkansas, it looks really rough. There's multiple converging threats for Arkansas. I'll go outside and I'll be able to see many living things that don't have habitat elsewhere in town that are interacting and living in their lives. If we're going through a bottleneck, we know that small populations matter in a bottleneck. I think it can be a meaningful part of people's personal practice to do what they can to nurture life and preserve biodiversity. And that even in worst case scenarios, these small reproductive populations of living things are important. You don't know what your legacy to the future of life can be, but we know that in previous significant mass extinctions, terrestrial organisms survived at higher rates than marine organisms. The work that we do can matter for the future of life.
You brought up before this idea of developing internal mechanisms of resilience, and then you also mentioned that you do habitat creation. I'm wondering, especially when talking to these people that are taking it very seriously, as they should, about the extinction event, just a plethora of different converging climate disasters that are on the horizon, and some of them are already here. What are some kind of personal habits, internal mechanisms that people can cultivate so they can put on that oxygen mask?
I think that many different traditions give us tools that help us access a mindfulness, a presence in the here and now. We can't I think it's critical that we not let our anxiety stop us from doing the things that could help to preserve life today and that could protect us in the future. And the more that we're able to stay present in the moment, to focus on what our senses are telling us in the moment, I think that that can help us to stay connected to the present and our potential for action. I think it can be very helpful for people to have like a object that has really good sensory textures that they can hold and remind themselves that they're here and now. Anything you can do to have a little ritual, that lets you help you be really present in your life. You can have a tea ritual. You can have a ritual around meditation or prayer. Something that helps you be fully present and fully in your body. I see this as critical for dealing with the fact that we are moving into a harder future. And it helps me to like acknowledge that I'm still in the good times. I can see that things are going to get worse. It's extremely likely that things are going to get worse. But do I want to spend the good times crying? I think there will be enough time to cry later. I think that now it's time to live as beautifully, as nurturingly to life as we can live.
On that note, I'm curious if you've heard of the idea of active or engaged Buddhism. Some of like the proponents of it, like Thich Nhat Hanh, where they talk about Buddhist teachings, but they really emphasize that active, engaged aspect of mindfulness. When a lot of people, I think they think of mindfulness as it could be seen as almost a retreat or an escape in some way.
I think that Buddhism has some really excellent structures to help scaffold people towards an active and engaged mindfulness. A lot of my personal mindfulness practice comes out of the Jewish tradition, which, Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism all kind of get really wound together deep, far back in the tradition. There was a lot of geographic proximity. And there's a strong Jewish tradition about preserving hope and joy in the face of overwhelming suffering. And that spirit to me is very animating. I think that there are attitudes and truths out of many different world religions that people can draw from times of intense suffering, how people have managed to persevere, take action, and find joy even in the very hard times. Buddhism, I do think, has the clearest path that people can take up elements of and improve their daily practice to improve an active and present way of living.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Especially they talk about like intrabeing and kind of the connectivity of things, which was something you discussed earlier, that even very small organisms, small kind of units of the ecosystem, you don't really know how disruptive it could be if they get disrupted or if there's like some sort of imbalance.
Or how
Mm.
productive.
Mm.
Like, so when I came out to my place in 2020, it was the pandemic, and the whole property had been totally bulldozed because they had to put in a new septic system and a new leach field to get the place up to code. And so I had this landscape where you could do whatever you wanted. And what I wanted to do was grow bugs because I think the insect collapse is one of the most serious things that we could intervene. We need habitat for insects. So I was able to be relatively successful as a bug farmer, which every gardener knows that's like easy. Number one goal, bug farmer can be easily unlocked. And what happened as I got more diverse insect populations was very interesting. I started seeing many predatory species. I saw many more arachnids and very large arachnids come in. And I started seeing more birds come in. Every year, I see more diversity of insect eating birds living in my area and nesting. I had 7 species of birds that I observed the nest successfully fledge out this year, which is more bird reproduction in more species of birds than I've ever observed in my life personally. Every North American mammal in range comes and gets snacks at my house. The monarch flyway goes through my yard now, and it never did before. And other people in my community have witnessed this. It's like the butterfly house at the zoo in my backyard at the peak of the migration. None of that was there before. And I think that experiencing what can happen with positive change, the life and beauty that can erupt if we think about making spaces for these small components of life, these building blocks of life, the insects, the plants, these small organisms, the change can be enormous. Everything wants to live. It needs places to live. Witnessing this potential for positive regenerative change can be deeply strengthening, particularly for people who are suffering with the earth right now, because this is a time of great suffering. There's no turning away from the loss that we're going to lose the reefs. There's no turning away from that pain. We just have to also try to cultivate joy. We have to hold them in both hands.
I guess to kind of wrap things up, I'm wondering what are some sort of techniques or methods people can use in order to engage with this generative growth, regenerative growth, maybe develop a sort of Disney-like house like you've described. Because I think a lot of people would be very interested in making those steps in any way. So it'd be good to hear if you can direct people to certain resources or actions.
So there are a ton of great YouTube channels about permaculture, about regenerative agriculture, but I'm actually going to direct people towards a very boring potential resource, which is their state extension office, their ag extension office, because that can be the best place to get hooked up with appropriate native plants for your area and suggestions for the species combinations that will really help life erupt in your place. And you can get plants often from very cheap there too. The Iowa Ag Extension Office has a plant nursery where you can get young trees for like $3 to $5 instead of $80 to $140, which I don't mean to say you shouldn't support your local nursery, but for someone who wants to put in like 40 trees, I think you'd rather pay $5 a tree, right? The state extension office and your state's GIS office from the USGS, the United States Geological Survey, can give you really good information about your soil type, what sort of native species are being recommended. And many of them are hooked up with the US Forest Service, which is doing extensive work to learn what kind of tree species need to migrate with climate change. That way you can plant a tree that you have reason to believe will continue to thrive at 2C or even beyond, and keep that canopy up and keep your yard cool and shaded, even in these times of change. I think that looking towards these less sexy resources can help you get a bigger bang for your buck. I highly recommend everyone check out their state extension office for information on this.
That's great advice. Yeah. To conclude, I'm wondering if there's any words or any sort of statement you'd like to make if you kind of had a megaphone to the whole world that you wish everybody could hear that's relevant to climate science and communicating science.
I think that it's important that we treat each other with respect, that we see that the reason that people are making their decisions isn't just because like they're dumb or they don't have all the information. They're making decisions in their own interests. But climate needs to be a big table. We need everyone to have a seat at this table, and everybody has something that they can offer. We need to change the way that we live if we're going to make a meaningful dent in this very complex problem we're dealing with. And so we need to talk about what matters to us. We need to talk about how do we bring what matters from our identities and our values forward, considering the biologic and planetary constraints that we're dealing with. I think that this move from science to values, from science to the way we live, from the way we act on the ground, is a conversation we need to have. I believe that we have the discourse tools, that we have the language tools and the decency to have that conversation. And I think that if more of us could commit to that, we could make real change.
Dr. Schoerning, it was a pleasure having you, and I feel like this probably resonated with a lot of people. You gave some really good practical advice, and I would like to direct everyone to your YouTube channel, American Resiliency. Put the link in the description below, as well as the website. But yeah, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. If I can add one final note, if you go to the YouTube channel and you search on the channel for the name of your state, for AMOC, that'll help you pull up the video with the targeted search term most easily if you search right on the channel. And if anyone has any questions, I am always glad to hear from people. It might take me a while, but I will write you back.
Yes, I'll put your the relevant email in the contact, if that's your preferred way to communicate.
And they can contact me through the webpage. That contact form works. When I switched over to the new website, it spent about a week shooting people into space, but I fixed it. So now we're okay.
Okay, that's good. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Schoerning.